Hello again. Now, Russia's intelligence agency, the GRU, has suffered what we could call some significant setbacks in recent weeks after, of course, the botched attempt to kill the former Russian agent Sergei Skripal in Salisbury. They remain, however, a big and powerful organisation who shouldn't be underestimated, and that is according to the former head of the Secret Intelligence Services, better known as MI6. So let's have a listen in to what he told me. Cliveden, a familiar backdrop for spies and scandal, famously playing host to the Profumo affair. Today the house is home to, among other things, a literary festival, which is where I sat down with the former head of MI6, Sir Richard Dearlove. He rarely gives interviews and hasn't spoken publicly since the attack in Salisbury. I started by asking him about Brexit.
I'm personally happy to see us ceasing to be a member of the EU, but I think, as I said, or have said before, I don't think you should see that as us leaving Europe. It's leaving a European treaty, and we would obviously still have a very, very close relationship with continental Europe.
Why are you personally happy? Do you see opportunities to perhaps forge new alliances or strengthen alliances?
Essentially, I see it as an issue of sovereignty. So I think that's a very important point. As I've said in the past, we've never been part of continental Europe's political ambitions to create, a more federated union. We've always opposed that. And, I think that the EU in its current form, I'm not suggesting it's going to disappear, but it radically needs change. And if it's going to have an inner core, which is, politically motivated, we're never, ever going to be an enthusiastic part of that.
So a good time to diverge then, if Europe is becoming closer politically?
I think it's a natural point of divergence for us. And I'm not underestimating the difficulties of leaving, but I'm absolutely confident that we can survive and thrive outside a continental alliance, but still be a major player in European geopolitics.
Is there a danger, though, to leaving the alliance at this point, when you have Donald Trump in the White House, the great disruptor, somebody who is a nationalist?
He says extraordinary things. He clearly behaves unpredictably. He clearly, I was going to say needs babysitting, but that sounds rather an insulting way of talking about the President of the United States, whoever it is. But on the other hand, I think there's still, a real solidity in the Anglo-American alliance.
I'm interested in your thoughts about another perhaps unpredictable political figure, Jeremy Corbyn, a man that you've previously described as a danger to this nation. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think someone coming from my background is troubled by Jeremy Corbyn's past associations, some of which I find surprising and worrying. He may have abandoned them now, but I don't think you can entirely, as it were, dump your past.
What past associations do you mean?
Well, he has managed to be an enthusiastic... he's enthusiastically associated himself with groups and interests which I would not say were the friends of the British nation.
There is a real possibility that he could be the next Prime Minister. Could you see a scenario when the security services are effectively withholding information from him?
No. And if he becomes Prime Minister, he becomes Prime Minister. That'll be the democratic decision of the British people. And in that position, certainly not. You have to treat him as Prime Minister. So I wouldn't, as it were, I'm expressing concerns about him and his political past, which I think are pretty extensively shared by a lot of people.
Now, some people close to Jeremy Corbyn have said that the deep state, by which they mean the security services, is hostile to a Labour government and might even use kind of dirty tricks against it. Andrew Murray, for example, suggesting in an article in the New Statesman that the fact that he was denied a security pass may be because of what he called the manoeuvrings of a deep state. Do you think they're right?
That's rubbish. I think, every government has been loyally served by the British security and intelligence community. And I imagine that every future government would be loyally served. So I absolutely do not agree with that. And I don't particularly like this concept of the deep state and somehow that some sinister power. I mean, it's just is sort of conspiratorial thinking, which I think is inappropriate in a political context in a modern democracy.
Do you think, though, that the security services has a responsibility to do its part to combat that kind of thinking, though? I mean, by being more transparent, by being more open, by being more accountable? There is a secrecy surrounding it.
I think that, there's much greater transparency than there used to be. I mean, that's developed significantly. We have Parliamentary Oversight Committee for the Intelligence and Security Community as part of the Intelligence and Security Act. And they need to keep their secrets. But on the other hand, to suggest that the British community is not under full political control is just not the case.
I'm keen to talk to you as well about Russia in the wake of what's happened in Salisbury. How big a setback is it for an espionage unit like the GRU to be effectively blown open in what happened in Salisbury?
Well, it does look like a rather incompetent operation, and an operation which was probably not sufficiently well prepared if they had a specific objective. Yes, I mean it damages their reputation, but the GRU is a big, powerful, well-funded organisation, and we shouldn't underestimate the problems that they can still cause, even when they've had a significant setback.
And of course, what it does also do is underline the threat to the UK from Russia. Do you think that more needs to be done to combat that threat from Russia? Because it does feel as if little has changed, really.
We're no longer in the Cold War, and I don't see that the threat that Russia presents now is equivalent to the situation that we had during the Cold War. However, Russian espionage, Soviet espionage has never stopped. It's deeply embedded in Russia's DNA to use the capabilities that it has to disrupt other nations, to pursue their own national interest, to, as it were, reinforce Putin in power. And this is actually the attack in the UK, I think fits a historical pattern. Russia historically has always used assassination as a weapon. It's part of the Russian political DNA. It's a rather terrible thing to say, but it's a violent country and they tend to kill each other.
One way, I guess, of tackling the Russian threat, I mean, this was an attack carried on UK soil, wasn't it, would be to look at Russian money in London. I mean, the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee, for example, putting out a report in May 2018 saying very explicitly, the assets stored and laundered in London both directly and indirectly support President Putin's campaign to subvert the international rules-based system, undermine our allies, and erode the mutually reinforcing international networks that support UK foreign policy. I mean, is that something that should be looked at?
Well, my understanding, it is being looked at, and there's a change in legislation now in terms of the powers the government has to confiscate, unexplained assets. Yeah, inevitably, one should look more closely at these issues, but one has to draw a distinction between Russians or Russian nationals and the Russian state. Okay, some of them may be closely, associated with Putin and Putin's regime. I mean, others may not be. So it's not a sort of black and white issue, in my opinion.
How worried are you as well about Russian attempts to influence democracy in the West, the US election, in the Brexit vote?
Well, they have a formidable clandestine capability which has been applied to social media. Russia has always disrupted politically those nations which it has seen as both hostile and now, you could put a slightly lower level unfriendly to it. Okay, I think we've been quite shocked to discover the recent extent of meddling, but there again, this has a historic pattern. I mean, it's usually been exercised by the Russians in relation to the countries in its immediate periphery, which, since the time of Ivan the Terrible, it set out to weaken the polities around Russia to make sure that, there was no immediate threat. And in a way, it's an extension and continuation in very modern terms of that type of approach.
We talked a lot about Russia. Just finally, I'm interested in your thoughts on what are the big security threats facing Britain now at this time that we're in.
Obviously, terrorism remains a problem. Migration, I think, remains a major problem. The whole issue of our dependence on cyber capability and on the difficulty we have in controlling cyber from a security point of view. So, there's an enumeration of problems, some of which are very new and some of which fit into a very well-established geopolitical pattern.
But quite an uncertain moment globally.
Well, I think we're in a rather extraordinary moment historically, which is both exciting and will contain opportunities, but also, might look like a cliff edge if we make poor decisions or we don't have the right sort of political leadership.